Okay, so we'll start with your name.
Well, my real name is Sterling F. Higgins, okay? I guess my mom and dad were scared by an insurance agent or something like that. But along in life, why people started calling me Jack, because there was a Jack Higgins who published a book called The Eagle Has Landed. And so I said, hey, that's a good name, so call me Jack, okay?
All right. And what's your date of birth?
Okay, my date of birth was at a very early age. I was born on April the 15th, 1926.
Where were you born?
Yeah, that was in Highland Park, Michigan, okay, just a little community outside of Detroit.
Okay. And if you could tell me what branch of the service you were in?
I was in the Navy, submarine service, so forth, but I took some classes ahead of time before I went into the submarines directly because I needed to add a little education dealing with electronics as they were preparing. The Navy knew that they were very short on people dealing with electronics, and that was a blossoming territory in 1943 and 44.
Mm-hmm. And what rank did you attain?
I exited the service with what's called a radio technician second class, an RT, okay. We had the symbology of a radioman, so everybody started calling me Sparks, but I didn't have anything with the dot and dash community. But I had 640 vacuum tubes in sockets 24/7, and that was my job to take care of all the internal and external communications.
Okay.
Including radar and sonar, a few other odds and ends.
Great. And what year did you enter?
I entered late 43, early 44.
Okay. And you enlisted, or were you?
I enlisted. I apparently got a fairly good grade on what's called the Eddie test because they knew that they were short on electronics maintenance activities. And so Captain or Commander Eddie had an exam passing it around amongst the high school people, and I was pretty decent in math, physics, and chemistry, and I enjoyed all of them.
Great. Okay, so let's rewind a bit. We'll go back to Highland Park, Michigan, and talk a little bit about your family life, childhood, growing up, that sort of stuff.
Okay. Well, my dad was a disabled veteran from World War I, so forth. He had a little gas problem in France and so forth, but he was with the Air Force area, things like that. My mother was basically raised on a farm in the Maryland area, and probably graduated from the 8th grade at the best, okay? But she was a good housekeeper and things like that, good mom and dad. But I can't tell you anything about the Highland Park area because I think we moved within the time I was maybe 6 months old. But between my birth and about age 5 or 6, I spent times in Michigan, Illinois, Maryland, and Massachusetts area before moving into Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's where we stayed for quite some time because my dad had advanced tuberculosis, which brings up an interesting situation. I'll come to that later. So a dry climate was recommended for him, and that's why we settled for a while in Albuquerque before we moved to Southern California at about 1932. So kind of a diverse area. Yeah. We moved around quite a bit.
And were you an only child? Did you have siblings?
I had two brothers. One was a kind of an offspring from, I guess, a one-night stand by my mother, who deceased very early in 1918, and was buried over in Maryland area. And then I have a brother. Let's see, his name was Walter, and he deceased at about age 2. That was in about 1923, 24, 25, and I was born in 26. So neither of my brothers or two brothers are alive today. I'm the only one surviving.
Okay, and so you spent most of your childhood moving around a bit. Until you settled in Southern California. What age were you then?
Well, in 1932, I went to kindergarten in Albuquerque, and so I was a grand total of about 4 or 5, 6 years old at the time. And then we ultimately moved to Southern California, and I guess that was about 1930, late 32 or early 33, okay? And settled in with a little house on the back of my dad's sister's property and so forth in Burbank, California. And I've lived in Southern California ever since then.
Okay. And where'd you go to high school?
I went to high school at Burbank High School and graduated there.
And growing up, what were some of your activities did you play sports? What did you do for fun?
Sports, not too much of that. Somehow I got kind of involved in a little more of the scientific area. I enjoyed physics, enjoyed chemistry. I was not too good in math early on, but when I really finally caught on in junior high school, things started to take off. One of the highlights, I enjoyed going to some of the lectures in physics at Caltech, so forth, and so I went over there one day to meet up with Dr. Fowler, who had a public presentation dealing with some of the atomic physics, and it raised my interest in that area. And after the class was over with, or the demonstration was over with the Wilson cloud chamber, etc., everybody left. However, I wanted to ask a few questions. I can't remember what those questions were. I was talking to Dr. Fowler. Presently, the door opened on the side, and a tall, slender guy came in wearing a fedora. I have no idea what his name was. I was introduced to him. I had a nice conversation with him and told that person about my theory of atomic physics and so forth, and he was very gracious and so forth. But I had to come to the conclusion in later life that it was only identified as one very interesting person, Robert J. Oppenheimer. But I didn't know him at the time.
Okay.
Had very good instructors and so forth during class, and I thought that I think sparked a lot of my interest.
Okay. And I guess moving forward to the beginning of the U.S. involvement in the war, Pearl Harbor.
Okay.
You remember where you were? And
I knew exactly where I was. I was at 545 North Palm Avenue in Burbank, California, with my buddy Julius Hulf. And I don't know what was happening, but we did listen to the radio, and all of a sudden the announcement came that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And so we had quite an argument about where is Pearl Harbor, because we really didn't know. It just had to be over around the Japanese islands or the Marshall Islands or whatever, but we never even dreamed that it was so close to shore, okay? But we had an interesting argument, so that started a lot of the activities, and so I think I really put in a lot more time in physics and chemistry and math and so forth, studies from that point on. And had some good chemistry. Old Doolin was very good in chemistry. Had a young fellow by the name of, not as well as young, Taylor. He was good in math, and I was getting on very good in there in junior high and high school area. So finally graduated in very late 43, very early 44. We had graduation, commencement, and so forth, and the graduation dance and so forth on one night. And I was on the train to Chicago, Illinois, to the boot camp of the following morning. Okay.
So, what made you decide? Why did you choose the Navy over?
Well, I guess the Eddie test was really the deciding factor, because if we got a decent grade and accepted the use of the results of the Eddie test, why our boot camp was only 4 weeks long instead of like 6 or 12 weeks, as other cases might be, because they wanted to get people into the service and out into the field as quickly as possible. And I chose the going into the Navy because that was where the Eddie test originated.
Okay. And did your friends all, did you guys all kind of go and enlist at the same time, you and your friends, or
Well,
did you have any friends that
Well,
enlisted?
my buddy, Red, he enlisted, I think a few weeks earlier, and went into the Marine Corps, uh, earlier than I. I went into the Navy very early in January, and went to boot camp in Illinois, and then after 4 weeks went to Wright Junior College for a review course in math, physics, and chemistry, about 4 weeks and so forth, before moving on to what was then known as the Del Monte Hotel, which is now known as the U.S. Navy Postgraduate School for Languages and things of that order, but over in the Monterey, California area. Very nice, spent three months there in class number 3, okay, I remember that quite well. So we did a very good job, had to build our own radios, do our own, that was more than just crystal sets and things of that order. Had a really good opportunity, then moved on into 6 months over at Treasure Island in the San Francisco Bay area, where we picked up an awful lot more in terms of radio receivers, transmitters, sonar, radar, and also LORAN equipment, things of that order. And I did reasonably well. So I think I graduated at number 9 in the class. So not too shabby. Okay, felt good about it.
Yeah.
So then went on to Fort Trumbull in the Connecticut area, not too far outside of New London, Connecticut. And instantly, kind of back up a notch. While I was in boot camp, I met up with a young chap. He was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, but for some reason we kind of fell in step, and so we were kind of buddies of each other. And so, but after Wright Junior College, well, he went one direction and I went to another direction. So we were separated for quite some time. But when I got back to Fort Trumbull in Connecticut, he was already aboard submarines and so forth back there. So he invited me, hey, come down and see what a submarine looks like. So I had my first eye-opening of what the boat looks like. And lo and behold, when I finished classes at Fort Trumbull, I was transferred to a boat, and guess what? On the same boat that he was. So we went overseas together, which was kind of an interesting thing.
Great. So how long after you started boot camp to when you were actually deployed?
It was about 9 months.
Okay. And you said your training mainly involved working with radios?
In the repair and maintenance of all electronics equipment.
Okay.
Audio equipment, the transmitters, receivers, sonar, radar, you name it. Okay. It just, hey, how do you look at electronics schematic and start repairing it?
Sure. Okay. And where were you deployed?
Well, out of New London, we did a lot of practice work out of New London because we were just a brand new boat, the Dentuta SS 335, which I have on my license plate on the car. We did a lot of work in the Long Island Sound and so forth. In fact, we had to lay on the bottom for a while they were doing some practice depth charges and things like that, and just calibrating equipment, making sure our equipment was working. And then when we finally left New London, we went down the coast, went down through the hurricane off of Cape Hatteras and so forth. And I must say, I was a little bit ill on the side. But we finally made it down to Key West and so forth to spend a day or two down at there. Then went across the Caribbean to the entrance to the Panama Canal, went through the canal and on up to Pearl Harbor. And we spent a few days in the good old Pink Palace there, the Royal Hawaiian, just as an R&R. And it was very kind that the skipper and a few others around the officers, I guess, saw that we had a reasonable supply of some beverages, okay? It kind of kept us happy and things like that. But it was real nice to say, here we are, we just had to get up in the morning and go to bed at night because we had freedom of walking out the back door of the hotel and right on Waikiki Beach, and we had a very pleasant time. But finally we had to board the ship and load stores, get stores loaded and things of that order. And so we put out through Pearl Harbor, and I can remember standing on the forward deck as we passed out now, looking back at land and saying, you know, maybe this is the last time I get to see dry land and so forth. We had to throw the jack staff overboard in the harbor. That's just kind of an old tradition, is to clear the deck from loose equipment.
What's a jack staff?
It's a little, holding a small flag on the forward bow and so forth. Just, it's a little blue flag with little stars on it, just called a jack staff. But so anyway, we had to throw that overboard. It's just a traditional type item. But a lot of history there, because I think submarines, well, let's say maybe making it, do you want any history dealing up with Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, my understanding of the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor is they did an awful lot of damage in terms of the airports around the area, big battleships, cruisers, etc., destroyers. They overflew submarine base with, just ignored it like it's too small, okay, throw it away, forget about it. But one of the sailors aboard one of the boats was manning a .50 caliber machine gun and shot down one of the Japanese flyers or bombers and so forth. So we at least scored a little bit early on, okay? But then, as time went on, I think about within 3 days, many of the submarines there at the base were loaded with stores and heading out much east toward the Japanese islands. And so that we were literally the first warriors heading off to go to war, really. The aircraft carriers were stationed offshore, and the Japanese didn't even know about it. So there we are. We were the early start. But I didn't go overseas until early '45, and 1945. But leaving Pearl, our first stop was around Saipan. The Japanese had basically abandoned Saipan. In fact, I guess they're learning about from the Japanese imperial forces and so forth that the Americans were really terrible people. They really just killed everybody and so forth. So many of the islanders on Saipan were jumping over a cliff just to commit suicide so they wouldn't have to experience a horrible situation, which was not really true. But we did put in there a little bit before taking off eastwardly. It went up through the passageways and through the lower areas of the Philippine Islands and on down to the straits between Formosa and the China coast. And that was our basic patrol area. Not only had one patrol, but it was very healthy. We did a lot of patrol work. The Barb had left that particular territory a couple of months earlier, and so we basically tracked some of the activities of the Barb. And on the way in toward the Formosa, we came across a couple of Japanese XPCs, and with gun action, we took them out of the water and so forth, and that was confirmed by an overflying U.S. aircraft that left them burning and sinking in the way out there. So I have no idea how many people we killed or did not kill, whatever, but it was kind of an interesting thing. In fact, my buddy Linky was standing on one side of the shears, and I was standing on the other side of the shears, because we'd kind of traded off between the radar and standing on the surface. And a small arms bullet hit the shears right in back of us and ricocheted in back of Linky and in back of myself. If it had been over about 8 to 18 inches, I think it would have killed both of us, and so right then and there. But we survived that comfortably. Went on down into the Formosa Straits. We took a lot of little work there, and very late one evening, the sun was settling down. And it was getting very dark. It was no moonlight, so it was strictly starlight. Off the radar, we picked up a fairly decent target, but we couldn't decide whether it was a big rock close into shore or whether it was a ship tied up close into shore. So we monitored it for a little while, and presently we saw a doorway open up with a man in it and close within about 2 seconds' time, and we decided that rocks don't do that. So since the water was only a few 30 foot of water at the time, steam fish was not a good choice for torpedo action. So we had to turn around 180 degrees to get the electric fish from the after room. So we fired 3 torpedoes at it. One torpedo went slightly after the aft area and exploded against the shore, but that put a nice white cloud in back of the target area so we could get a good outline. And then the other 2, one hit forward of the midship and the other one hit just after the midship. And it goes pop, pop. We thought, gee, is that it? Is that all? And suddenly the whole midships blew up. And lo and behold, I happened to look at the clock on the ship as I went down from the shears down into the conning tower. It was exactly midnight. It happened to be the 4th of July, 45. I mean, how significant. We had our own fireworks thousands of miles away from home.
Wow. So could you explain a little bit about you mentioned the type of torpedoes?
Oh, well, the forward room had steam, what's called steam fish. They were powered by burning alcohol and water, generating steam, powering the turbines to drive the torpedoes. The electric fish in the after room was strictly by batteries, but the steam fish, when you fire them, they make an initial dive very deep, kind of before resurfacing up and picking up the right level. And so they would have just gone into the mud and so forth and been ineffective. But the electric fish would go straight out and then go, okay? So that's why we had to choose the electric fish for that particular action. But we did our little piece of action there, and I think everybody kind of enjoyed that.
Where was this exactly?
We were in a place called Nam Quam Harbor, right on the China coast. In fact, we went up the river a little ways in that area, probably about, I thought we went up maybe 10 miles, but it might have been only 1.5 miles because you'd lose track of the dimensions unless you're actually doing the navigation area. But it was very quiet. We had a lot of the Japanese fishermen were out there with their little lanterns on their boats and so forth that we passed, but we were all on batteries, so they didn't even know we were around, hopefully.
Now, what was the name of the vessel you were on?
We were on the USS Dentuda, Dentuda, SS 335. It was a boat manufactured by General Dynamics at Electric Boat Company, New London, Connecticut.
Okay, and how large was the crew? How many men?
Well, we had 92 aboard and so forth, so people would think we were pretty crowded, but you usually have 1/3 of the crew on duty at one time. The other 2/3, maybe 1/3 is sleeping. The other third is doing whatever they need to do personally and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And how big was the vessel?
Well, the boat was 311 foot long. It had a 27-foot beam, and we drew 21 foot of water while we were on the surface and so forth. And so when you have only 30 foot of water in the bay, we only had 9 foot of clearance. So during that whole action on Nam Quam Harbor, 2/3 of the crew were topside. So in case something happened, we needed to abandon. 2/3 of the crew were ready to go.
Yeah. And how often were you guys submerged rather? How often were you guys submerged rather than being?
Well, with the diesel electric boat, we only had air capacity for 60 to 72 hours and so forth. So that's about the maximum we could stay submerged for any one length of time. Mm-hmm. So we were primarily on the surface as much as possible to try to recharge batteries and so forth and see what's going on.
Okay. And were you guys traveling in a fleet, or were there other submarines?
All by ourselves.
All by yourselves.
We were, in fact, to give you an example of that, we had 4 runs on us by aircraft with bomb bays all open, ready to go, and they were all U.S. aircraft, no Japanese. It was pretty late in the war. The Japanese Air Force had been pretty much taken care of. Mm-hmm. So we have to look out for the Air Force.
Um, and the ship, how many torpedoes would it hold at any given time?
I think we carried about 24 torpedoes altogether.
Was it 12 of one and 12 of the other?
Well, no, probably about 9 of them in the after room. Let's see, we've got to stop. We have 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. We probably had about 10 torpedoes aft and the balance forward.
Okay.
Each of them containing about roughly 600 pounds of TNT. Mm-hmm. It's kind of comfortable to sleep next to a torpedo. But hey, it's okay. It's all right.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about day-to-day life on board?
Well, every time, of course, with 640 vacuum tubes, that was my charge, and so every waking moment, I literally was going from station to station to station, just checking equipment to make sure it was functional. And I must say that one piece of equipment I had to spend about 50% of my time on repairing it. And fortunately or unfortunately, it was manufactured by RCA. And so to this day, anytime somebody offers me the purchase of any RCA equipment, I have to turn my back and go away. It so soured me. But a lot of the other equipment was go, 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 and it just very rarely was it off, but it had to test it to make sure.
Great.
One day, this situation happened. We were on the surface patrolling around, and I was doing some repair work or testing work in the conning tower on some of the sound gear. And it was kind of cramped in the quarters that I was in. So my back was hurting a little bit, so I decided to kind of break away from what I was doing and kind of stand up. But while I stood up, I don't just stand there and exercise. I grab a hold of the periscope, raise the periscope, and look up at the bow. And then I start scanning down the starboard side, just scanning around the horizon just to see if there's anything going on, whatever. And adding a little bit to the lookouts that were topside. And presently, as I passed the starboard beam, I saw something come up and raise and then fell back down. It's the same kind of activities we do aboard the boat when we get preparing, ready to fire. Take the last look before actually firing. So I went over to the upper conning tower, Doug, and yelled up to Doug, as the OD of the day, and I said, "Hey, Doug, I swear to God I saw a periscope about 1,000 yards out on the starboard beam." He yells down, "Left full rudder." My buddy on the helm in the conning tower flipped it over, and we kind of leaned over, passed away. So I looked at some of my equipment that was there, and we have a torpedo data detector. And lo and behold, I swear that the record showed that we had 2 torpedoes pass by on the starboard side. So if I hadn't been on the periscope, God only knows where, I don't think I'd be able to talk to you today. But the message was, nobody ever sees a periscope. You don't see that. Well, I'm sorry. I swear I saw a periscope.
Yeah.
Whether I was right or wrong, it doesn't make any difference.
You're here now.
I did what I felt was the reasonable thing to do. Quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Better to be wrong in that situation.
Well,
Speak up.
What if I was wrong and didn't see a periscope and made a false report? Question: what damage did it do?
None.
But what good could it have done if it was a real one?
Sure.
And I still believe it was a real one.
Sure.
Okay. So to this day, 70 years later.
God bless you.
Anyway, another thing is we pitch out from our patrol area. We headed north and near the upper or the northern portion of Formosa at that time. We met up with the Argonaut and exchanged messages and so forth at our meeting point, and transferred documents, maps, whatever, and we put on over heading back toward Guam rest camp. Lo and behold, we passed not too far away from Okinawa, And lo and behold, here was the Okinawa Typhoon, the 45. And so we had to stay on the surface because if you dive, why, you don't know how long the storm is going to last, and will your oxygen run out. So you have to stay on the surface so you have the oxygen air available. With the new nuclear boats, why, sorry, you can stay down, it's very comfortable, and let the storm go on. But we were taking 49-degree rolls, and there was a light aircraft carrier about 4 miles away, and it was heading right directly into the storm. And the last I saw of that carrier was in Pearl Harbor when it was in dry dock, and about the forward 75 feet of the flight deck was bent at about a 45-degree angle. I don't think you could get an airplane on or off that carrier after that storm, but that's what the storm house, an illustration of how strong that storm was, okay? So we traveled on a little ways, and we were crossing the Marianas Trench on our way back to Guam. And I guess the skipper, trying to follow the little good old rule book, decided, well, let's do a little exercise, we'll dive. So we went down, and 1,500 feet or so, traveled along for a while. Presently, it surfaced. Well, the executive officer was acting as the substitute diving officer at the time. I was on the sonar gear in the conning tower, and we surfaced, and the skipper and the quartermaster went topside, and I could hear them talking to each other. And pretty soon I heard the skipper say to the quartermaster, he says, "Uppy," the name was Upchurch, he says, "something's wrong." And all of a sudden he says, "Clear the bridge." So the skipper dropped immediately down through the hatch. The quartermaster came secondly and grabbed the lanyard on the upper hatch, and he turned himself completely upside down, pulling the hatch closed. As I looked up, I saw a wall of water about 3 foot high closing in on the hatch. Fortunately, the uppy kept 1 foot on either side of the hatch, and it's totally upside down. It looked like a monkey on the end of a cord and so forth. I could talk to him face to face, literally, and his feet were topside. Anyway, he got the hatch closed, and we only took on a few hundred gallons of water, unfortunately, but that filtered on down through to the control room and the auxiliary room underneath the control room, so forth. So pumped that water out. But anyway, we in process of surfacing. Of course, we had shut down the electric motors and operated strictly on batteries. All the diesel engines were off. So we lost forward motion. So we settled very rapidly by stern first. And of course, we're only supposed to go down to about maybe a maximum of about 500 feet. But the depth gauge back in the after room registered 820. The one we had in the conning tower only listed that in at 720. But there we were with 30,000 foot of water underneath us. But we managed to finally get a little forward motion and finally got back to the surface with only a few shear valves broken and a little bit of water coming in the boat. But we managed to clear through. And then this was getting to be late July of 45, and as we were approaching Guam area, I guess it was still several hundred miles away, but we were in after battery area, and there was typical little BS going on and cackling back and forth. Old Red Holly says, "You know, I wonder what submarines are going to be like in the future." That little light talk. And of course, I had a lot of interest in physics and things like that, and learned a little bit about that back in high school. And my casual meeting with Fowler and Oppenheimer, that I didn't know any understanding of who he was or what he was at the time. I said, well, all submarines are going to be nuclear powered. They'll be able to go back and forth across the ocean 3 or 4 times before surfacing, before refueling, and could remain underwater for a long period of time because they have so much energy, they'll be able to do their own thing. Well, oh, that created such a hackling, and all the guys there, I was the laughing stock of the boat. That's the most hilarious story you have ever heard. So I was literally the laughing stock Well, we finally got ashore in Guam and up to Camp Dealey, which is opposite, not too far from Talifofo and Hammer Air Force Base. And so kind of resting up there at the base. And all of a sudden, here comes the little camp newspaper and says, Hiroshima bombed, U-235. And a lot of people on the boat started looking at me like, what does he know that we don't know? And so I had my retribution without saying a word. So that made me very comfortable. But the hilarious thing, though, I got to go back to my buddy Linky. We were just basically right out of high school, and neither of us very cared much for beer. We didn't like the taste of it. It was a terrible thing. So we never had a beer going anyplace. Anyway, when we first landed in Camp Dealey, we're kind of walking around together and just kind of getting the lay of the land. Meanwhile, we knew that there were some Japanese nearby up in the mountains and so forth, because we had reports that something like 11 people off of one of the other boats that's been there decided to go for a hike back in the mountains, and none of them came back. So we didn't go back up into the mountains. But anyway, while walking around the camp area and getting acquainted with things, I got kind of thirsty, but there was a drinking fountain, so we went over to the drinking fountain to get a little drink. And my God, we could not stand that water. It was all oil tasted, because the military came in and the CBs sprayed water on all of the reservoirs around the area, sprayed oil on it to kill off the mosquitoes and so forth and get some control over that. So Linky and I decided that, lo and behold, we couldn't stand the water, so we just had to have beer. But we could buy only 2 cans at a time. It cost us 10 cents, but a nickel a can. So I agreed to I'll buy 2 cans for breakfast. Linky, you buy it for lunch, and I'll buy them for dinner, and we'll alternate that way. And that's how we got through our 2 weeks at rest camp and so forth. But on beer. Yeah. But anyway, when I did go off on a convention later on, fast forward, there was a submarine convention in Pennsylvania, and of course Linky and his wife were both deceased. So I insisted on his daughter and her husband to take me over to the cemetery, but I had to have 2 bottles of beer. And so I knelt down on his grave, and I opened up 2 bottles of beer, and I sipped on one and poured a bottle of beer to him. So we had our first beers together, and we had our last beers together. Okay, I thought that was nice. It was very, very emotional to me personally. Yeah. But another thing which had problems there at rest camp is one night, well, we had the guards on the gates and so forth, all fenced around. There was a young boot that was standing guard. It was kind of night, dark, and he had just arrived from boot camp and so forth, so he had his 45 and things like that. Anyway, he happened to notice that somebody went through the fence a little ways away. I'll pick a number like 50, 75 yards. So the young guard called out, "Halt, halt, halt." Nobody halted, but so he pulled out his 45, pointed in that direction and fired a shot. Lo and behold, there was a chief warrant officer that decided to go see a girlfriend in the city, and so he skipped over through the fence and was walking away. That 45 shot cut him right in the back of the head, killed him directly. So the next day, of course, they had a captain's mast right then and there, brought up the boot guard and so forth. Of course, found him guilty, charged him, fined him $2, gave him a carton of cigarettes, and transferred him to another base, as they rightfully should be, because that protected him under the double jeopardy routine. Okay, so he had a full charge act right then and there. The guy was doing his job, okay, protecting the base. Too bad the other guy lost it.
Yeah, it's a shame.
Your next question.
Yeah. It's a lot to digest. Um, so can you talk a little bit about maneuvering through the submarine itself? Like how, was it pretty small, tight quarters or?
The quarters are pretty compact, but you get to a little routine. Everybody knows that you pass on the right, so if you're passing somebody, he's coming the opposite direction, you just flip right by with no problem whatsoever. There's just about enough width that two people can pass rather comfortably, and you have no problem. The only problem you have at all is getting to any of the bulkheads that has a watertight door, because there's a little ledge that you have to clear and kind of duck your head. So you, for first approach to the boat, well, you probably knock your head a few times and so forth. After that, you slip right through it. Just like, what? That's so easy. I mean, why, any child can do that, okay? I mean, it seems like it's complicated, and yet it isn't. As far as the boat is concerned, it's divided into a number of compartments. There's a forward torpedo room, then there's what's called the officers' quarters, and underneath the officers' quarters is a set of batteries and so forth there, called the forward batteries deck. Then there's the control room, then there's the mess hall, and then that's followed by the it's called the after room. That's where a lot of us sleep, have bunks and things like that, 2-3 bunks high. You have a clearance of about 18 inches and so forth. It looks like you're pretty much cramped in, but we kind of do a little hot bunking and things like that. When one guy gets out, another guy gets in and so forth, and you're tired, you can go to sleep right away. Mm-hmm. And whenever you dive, it's interesting that there's two blasts of the klaxon, which sounds like an old Model T Ford horn. With two blasts of the klaxon, if you're asleep, you wake up, or at least I did. I'd wake up, and I'm listening for main induction to close. When it closes, I can just drop back, and I'm sound asleep right away. But the interesting thing about it is when you surface, you're submerged, and now you get 3 blasts of the same klaxon. And lo and behold, I don't even bother to wake up. Why the brain creates the differential like that, I have absolutely no idea, but that's the way it works. I didn't have to worry about main induction closing because of the old Squalus from way back when, okay, pre-war times. But moving around, you could move around quite easily. We had 3 chow downs in the mess hall area. The chefs had a very nice little cramped quarters for cooking and things of that order, which kind of reminds me of the time when I was in Pearl Harbor. My buddy from high school, old Red Hulf, he was in the Marine Corps and he was stationed over there. And so, hey, come on over and I'll take you to show you what a submarine looks like. So he did. And it was getting close toward dinner time. So,
yeah, you can pause.
Where did we leave off?
Well, you're kind of talking about
the quarters.
Yeah, the quarters and all that, and the horn sounding when it was.
The klaxons and things like that. Yeah.
So how long would it take for you to resurface once you made that decision?
Well, in terms of diving, when the klaxon go off to dive, we can be at 50 feet in 32 seconds. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's pretty quick. So you don't lollygog around climbing down the hatches, you jump down. And I guess that's where got my leg kind of hurt up a little bit and so forth, just because you don't step. You just take one step and it's about 9-foot drop. Mm-hmm. Then you're down on the deck and you get cleared away because if you don't, you're going to have somebody on your shoulders quick.
You got somebody coming right behind.
Right on, so it's pretty tight. But you get accustomed to it and it just seems like it's a natural situation. I don't feel any inconvenience. In fact, here we are right now, sitting in my house here, and I feel like this is just another submarine because, look, you're completely enclosed, yeah. Okay? I mean, who knows, the roof could drop in on us and so forth. We're in a submarine all over ourselves. There's doors there where we can get in and out comfortably and so forth, but we don't feel any discomfort. I mean, I feel the same way when we're aboard the boats.
Very good. Now, can you talk a little bit about the role that submarines played during the war itself? I think a lot of people probably, it gets overlooked in a lot of instances. And
Well, I'd say the submarines played a very important part. Early part of the war, however, there was a problem that started in. Apparently, there was a reporter from the Chicago Tribune who either had a pull or wrangled his way around, but he got aboard one of the boats going out on a patrol. And I guess they had a pretty good patrol, a regular submarine patrol early in the war. When he came back, why, he wrote a nice little article for the Chicago Tribune. In the course of that article, he says, well, the Japanese were not dropping their depth charges deep enough. Right immediately after that, we lost about 10 submarines. I think the Japanese know how to read English too, okay? So needless to say, there was a lot of storm in the upper areas, and hence we became the silent service. We don't have anybody, guests aboard, except in port. We don't take any guests with us, etc., and we don't talk about what we do. And I guess that is primarily to elevate the suspicious type nature of the Japanese when one of the ships is out there and suddenly doesn't report back in. Oh, it must have been the gods that took that ship out. So submarines participated a great deal. One of the interesting ones early also in part of the war was Commander Ramage. One day while on patrol, he was out there and he happened to notice a little smoke off in the horizon. So they did a little following up on the radar, whatever, the best they could, kind of tracking the smoke. So they decided to dive, and while they were underwater, they made headway toward the track of this particular Japanese convoy or task force or whatever it was. Anyway, darkness set in, and again, it was one of those nights where there was no moon, just starlight. So he was right in the middle of the convoy as it came overhead.
pause.
Hello there. So anyway, this convoy came right directly over the top of them. And of course, they didn't detect him because I guess they weren't even bothered to look. Anyway, what Ramage did is he surfaces right in the middle of this convoy around midnight. And he takes up position. So he joined the Japanese Imperial Navy. Only he and the quartermaster were topside. So they were cruising along. Pretty soon off on the starboard side, there was a searchlight pointed toward him with a flashing code. And Ramage says, Quartermaster, did you get that signal? He says, yes. He says, take and flash that signal over here on the port side to the ships over here. And so he did, repeated the signal, got a signal back, and turned it around to the quartermaster and said, now send that signal over to the other side. It was the confirmation of the security codes for a safe passage. So he continued plotting. And anyway, with the 24 torpedoes that he had aboard, he ended up sinking something like 9 ships and raked a destroyer decks with 50 caliber machine guns and got away scot-free. I mean, tell me, the guy got the Congressional Medal. Beautiful job, beautiful job. Those are repeated situations. Anyway, to fast forward, in contrast, the submarines sank over 55% of all shipping sunk by all causes. That means the Air Force, the surface craft, and submarines. 55% of all shipping sunk by all causes in the Pacific. That's not too shabby. Unfortunately, we lost 52 submarines overall and about 3,600 men. A very cheap price overall compared to other areas. So I'm happy to have at least a little small portion of that.
And do you know how many submarines were operational in the Pacific?
Operationally, totally, I'm making a guess because I'm not really sure, but I think we had close to 400 submarines.
Okay.
But we lost 52 of them.
So your main goal was basically to patrol the waters.
Submarines were out there to patrol the waters, to cut off the supply lines to the Japanese islands. Basically, the food supply given to the islands, the oil, other type things that they had to import from Indonesia, et cetera. They had to try to bring a lot of that stuff in. Submarines are out there picking off the ships, every ship that they possibly could. In fact, one of the times, fast forward here to my recent flight up to on the honor flight, while we were sitting at dinner, one of the chaps across the table from me got wind that I had been aboard submarines. I thought he would just jump across the table and give me a big hug. But his message was, "You guys saved our ass." And I said, what about? And he gave me this story. He says, we were down in this particular straits, down in the southern Philippines, and we were kind of backed into an area, and there was a Japanese task force closing in toward us. The skipper got on the intercom and gave him the chat. He says, "Gentlemen, I want you to have a very, very good dinner tonight, because this may be the last dinner you ever have." But as this task force was closing in, there's one ship would disappear, and another ship would disappear, and there'd be another ship disappear out of the Japanese task force. Pretty soon they abandoned their forward motion and turned around and went home. Submarines apparently took their toll and saved their ass. And he was so thankful. I mean, he wanted to give me a kiss and big hug and everything. And very emotional to me and so forth, and I guess emotional to him too, okay? Yeah. There's tasks like that. You know what's better than a Marine? It's a submarine. That's what one of the other guys at the thing, he was in the Marine Corps. So he's talking about that, and I threw him that one, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh my goodness." Yeah, I could believe it. So we had a good pass, but I'm proud of the service that I had.
Yeah. Now, how long from your initial deployment, once you left, how long were you out at sea for?
I think on that particular one, I just have to guess. We were really at sea for the patrol from the time we left Saipan to the time we came back to Guam. I would pick that time period as possibly 55, 60 days, okay? Because we had some passageways from the Midway area or Pearl Harbor for fueling and things like that. So there had to be other passage.
Now, was there a way for you to communicate with other submarines or other ships? I mean, how would you be able to identify an enemy from a friendly?
Well, needless to say, we have a code, and the code is a variable one every day. I don't know how many times they change it during the course of the day, but at least once a day. And so whenever an aircraft comes over, zooming in on us, they're supposed to put out this code. Meanwhile, we have a receiver. And so then we have a piece of equipment called IFF, called Identification Friend or Foe. So we immediately have to transmit back a code. And if we confirm the code, then he breaks off from his dive, okay? And we're able to clear on through. Sometimes it's just a voice command, things of that order. Sometimes it's electronics command. That's how we kind of sneak through. But we're all out there. Nobody particularly likes us, okay? Yeah. We're everybody's target. Mm-hmm. I'll go back and do it again if I had to.
Yeah. Was there any point where you were fearful of not making it back home, or?
I think at the time that I had to throw the jack staff over at Pearl Harbor, that was probably my big fear.
Yeah.
Because I was looking back and saying, this might be the last time I ever have a chance to see dry land. Mm-hmm. But after that, okay, there were intermittent types of fear and things of that order, but you didn't have time to be afraid. Yeah. You had to be doing things. You couldn't waste your time, oh, I'm scared, okay? You just do the job that you need to do, and everybody else was doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really pulls us all through. But I must say, when we were there at Guam and kind of loading stores, getting ready to go out on patrol again, I'm doing my job, and I said, okay, I'll take a little break here. So I was kind of sunning myself on the bow of the boat, and this is in Apra Harbor in Guam. And all of a sudden, the whistles and bells on the other ships around the harbor started going off. The gunner's mate came up from down below, picked up a 5-inch shell from our storage area and threw it in the forward gun and fired it right directly over my head. That was VJ Day, 1945. So yeah, if I had my hands up high, I probably might have lost my right hand, okay? But unfortunately, I kept my hands down.
And you fired in celebration?
Oh, yeah, in Kellow celebration. But since he wasn't commanded to do that, he had a quick captain's mast and was discharged almost immediately. So that was his quick ticket home.
And what was your sentiment once you learned of the end of the war?
Well, I guess that the Japanese surrendered. All I could think of was, well, I guess we can prepare to go home and so forth. But we still have to wait until we get the orders to turn around. Like it could have been a false alarm, okay? Sure. Who knows? Things like that have happened before. But I can remember one night, Linky and I, while we're on our cruise back toward Pearl Harbor, it was kind of dark out, but the moon was up. We both went topside. We sat out there in the aft area on the cigarette deck. We just talked about the wonderful times and watching the moonlight across the waves. It was a nice, comfortable ride, just a little roll here, a little roll there, and so forth. And talking about some of the things we were looking forward to at home, whatever, or getting back on base, whatever. But some of the things that we've been through and things that we should look forward to in the future.
Now, were you able to keep in touch with family at all?
Oh, yes. Well, Linky and I were buddies literally from boot camp on through the whole war. And I think he got discharged about maybe a week or a month before I did. I got discharged sometime around May the 31st in '65. And I was discharged from the hospital area because they did surgery on my knee and so forth. I took out all the cartilage on my left knee. So I ended up with a disability on discharge, which actually was kind of a fortunate thing because my plans were set ahead for I was hearing about the GI Bill, and wow, what a wonderful opportunity, because Mom and Dad, they didn't have any money at all to put me through college and so forth, but the GI Bill was really kind of a welcome idea. So needless to say, I was sitting aside and planning ahead, and I put my requests in for a few junior colleges. I went over to Caltech and picked up one of their catalogs since I thought I would like to go to Caltech, so I got their catalog. And it's a kind of a good thing that I had done that. I don't know what prompted me to do it, but it was wonderful. So I kind of followed their catalog while I checked into Glendale Junior College. I found out that if I followed the catalog at Glendale College and took the classes specified, I would not be able to transfer them on over to Caltech or any of the other schools because they were sort of out of order. But I went over to John Muir, it was high school, they were putting GIs over there. And so I take the same classes, and they had them all tied up directly, just followed directly into Caltech and others. And so I followed the catalog in JC. And lo and behold, after 3 semesters, I graduated from junior college, so I had a post-grad semester. And I put in for admission to Caltech. I got honorable mention, but did not get entrance. So I moved around and I put in my request to University of California, Berkeley. They said, hey, this is great. You're fine, come on. All your units are transferable directly here except for this one class on materials. And because the JC did not have the equipment to do materials testing, whereas Berkeley did, and so that was the only class I needed to take over again. And lo and behold, they had the same books, the same everything. So it was kind of repeating the class, and I felt good. So anyway, the VA used to call me in every once in a while and say, "Jack, you can't take all these classes." I said, "Well, what in the bill says I can't?" He says, "Well, you just can't." I think they were looking more at my health rather than what the books had to say, because when I finally graduated with a bachelor's in electrical engineering, I used all 48 months of a GI Bill on the disability area, Public Law 95 versus Public Law 346. I graduated with 168 units, but I only needed 132. So I think I was kind of a busy guy in school. So it worked out really well. And I have to thank the GI Bill for all that activities in the VA, okay?
Great. Going back to the end of the war, do you remember where you were when you learned of the atomic bomb?
Well, I was in Guam. I was in Guam at rest camp when the Hiroshima bomb went off, and I guess I was there when the Nagasaki bomb went off, and I was in Apple Harbor when they surrendered. Mm-hmm. So I was all around that particular area, which is kind of unique because when I was at the VA hospital over here in Long Beach, there was a young chap, who was a male nurse kind of taking care of me. And they had kind of an interesting little accent. So I asked him where he's from. He says, he's from Guam. So I says, oh, do you know about Talifofo? And oh, well, that was right near where I live, okay? So I started telling him about how I remembered Guam and the sugar factory down near Agana area and how it was all pretty well torn apart. Various other odds and ends, Hammerfield, giving him these. And he's kind of shaking his head and he says, boy, you remember a hell of a lot of stuff, and I can't even hardly think about it. I was just amazed at what you're remembering. I'm sorry, but it's kind of ticked back. It kind of sticks, as you're hearing now.
Yeah, it's great though. So after the end of the war, how long until you got out of the service?
Well, I got out on the, like I say, around the 31st of May, but school didn't start until September. So I took a job with the telephone company working in the Mutual Exchange in downtown Los Angeles, working on the racks and dealing with the microwave link that they had between the Mutual Exchange and Salt Lake City. So we were doing a little wiring and cabling and things like that. And the people there, I enjoyed working with them. They had little classes, so they enjoyed my soldering and things like that and attaching the cables. They liked that because when I got around to telling them, I said, I'm going to leave because I wanted to go to school. Was, oh, hey, we want to have you here. You name your hours. Whatever time period you want, we'd like to have. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to put in full time at school. So they were disappointed, but I worked at a telephone company. Mm-hmm. Then left there, I guess then on a Friday, and the following Monday I was at John Muir College in Pasadena.
And what career did you take after? What career did you take after?
Well, since I graduated with a bachelor's in electrical engineering, I was kind of leaning toward electrical type work, someplace in that general area, because a lot of my classes were dealing with Yagi antennas and transmission areas and power situations, which came very handy later on in life, too many things. But I guess when I was leaning toward graduation a few weeks before, by the campus newspaper, the old Daily Cal, came out and it had a classified ad section. And I was looking at the classified ad, and here's an ad that says, wanted mathematicians, physicists, or chemists, chemistry majors for a short-term contract. 6 months someplace in the U.S. and 6 months overseas. Telephone number. Well, somehow it kind of perked my imagination. I said, well, God, I'd like to know a little bit more about this and so forth. So anyway, I called the telephone number, and I made arrangements for an appointment. Presently, two guys come, and they kind of described a little bit of routine that they were representing and working with the Atomic Energy Commission. And the particular goal was to set up an instrumentation network for 1,200 channels of data gathering for the nuclear tests in the spring of 1951 out at Enewetak Atoll. Anyway, we had a brief discussion about that whole thing. They looked over my resume and what have you, and we talked for a little while. I have no idea what we talked about. But anyway, they said, okay, fine. So then they went away. In later life, I learned that they went around the country, MIT, Caltech, Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon Institute, et cetera, pretty good schools around the country. They interviewed 168 people. They hired 25, and I was one. So report to Sandia Base, Albuquerque, Western Labs. We got a lot more detail about what was going on. We had to wait there for a little while we had FBI clearances and Q clearances for access to atomic data, things of that order. Meeting at the labs area out in the God, what do they call it? We had some hillsides area there with a lot of vaults on them with atomic bombs stored away. And we even, one of our tests out there in the field, we had 10 tons worth of TNT to do a blast just setting up some of our instrumentation. And so we took all that data from there in the Albuquerque area. Ultimately, after about 6 months of getting all the pressure gauges, temperature gauges, time of break, strain gauges, and so forth, we transported out on the, oh gosh, what was the name of that ship? Oh, I'll remember it sometime about 2 in the morning. But anyway, we took off, went over to through Hawaii. I left my camera at the Kodak company over there in Honolulu. And then we went on over and dropped off at Enewetak Atoll, where we offloaded our people and equipment and things like that. And that was at not NGB, but in Runnet Island, where they had the docks and the runways for the aircraft. And then later on, we had surface craft take us up to NGB and Musen Islands in the northern part of the Enewetak Atoll. And that's where we bunked in for about the next 6 months. And the temperature was always running about 85 degrees and about 85% humidity, so it was kind of warm, but you got kind of used to it after a while. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the 25 of us, and then we were given about 100 GIs, and we also had some of them back in Albuquerque, and they were still in the military type, and they were some of the people coming out of the OSS area that would be dropped off in strange places and breaking and entering. So it was kind of interesting that we were kind of teaching them a little bit of engineering, and they were teaching us a little bit of breaking and entering. And I must say the breaking and entering has been coming in handy so many times, just incidentally. In fact, in our neighborhood around here, when I take the dog out for a walk, meet any of the neighbors when we first moved in, I'd say, well, you know, if I'm out walking the dog and I see smoke coming from your house or water pouring out of the garage, I'm going to call 911. But if I feel like I can help preserve any of your property, look out, I'm going to break in. And not one solitary person has ever denied it. Go for it. They said, hey. And I said, and it's also a reverse situation. So it has become handy. Fortunately, I have never had to break into anybody's house, but it's become very useful in some of the places where I worked, where it was necessary to get into a building and didn't have any keys to it. And the people that did have the keys were not around, and lo and behold, I'm inside, and I'm opening the door outside so that the other people can come in. And they wonder, how do you do that? Well, you don't want to know. So you never know when the education that you get is so useful. Anyway, we did our instrumentation, set it up. In fact, we had a trench diggers out there, and they were digging away on this one particular trench, and all of a sudden up comes a shoe with a foot still in it and so forth. So the Eniwetok had been taken over by the Americans, so we had all sorts of interesting things. One guy even pulled a skull out of the lagoon. I picked up seashells and so forth, which I was happy to show my interviewer here. The things like that I picked up off the bottom of the water. Was so beautiful out there. I mean, you could just swim and you could see, literally hundreds of feet underwater. You could swim along with manta rays and seeing so beautiful wing spread and so forth. And everybody was just having a wonderful time being able to R&R that way. Anyway, we finally, when the blast, there was a 60 kiloton bomb on top of a 300-foot tower, went off while we were on a LST, anchored up about 17 miles away. And we had dark goggles on. The dark goggles are so dark that if you, on a noon day, if you put the goggles on inside and then walked outside and looked around the sky trying to position where the sun is, it's difficult to locate the sun. However, when that bomb went off, you could pick up a newspaper and read the front page with no problem right through those dark glasses. The temperature on your skin would be like holding a paper match lit and burning about an inch away from your cheek and so forth. You get the sense of the warmth of that bomb on your own skin. And then, of course, the shock wave comes in quite a few seconds later, and it is a tremendous bang. And we were back on the island within about 6 hours after the blast, recovering the data that had been recorded on magnetic tape. And we were all given basically diplomatic courier passports. So on our way back, we could go right through customs and so forth in Honolulu area, back on our other aircraft, and back into Albuquerque. But on the interesting thing, way back to Honolulu, we had some aboard the airplane. It was a Canadian Air Force jump plane that we were on. So it was kind of uncomfortable travel, but that's the way life goes. Anyway, we had to drop off at Johnston Island to drop off this biological stuff for their experiment work from out of Eniwetok. Got back into Honolulu, transferred through customs, and on another airplane went into Air Force Base up around Sacramento, and then on down to Sacramento. Turned in all of our magnetic tapes. We had a laboratory all set up to reduce the data, and put it over into a report, turned that in. Pretty soon, Dr. Sherwood Smith, who was at that time AEC's spokesman to Congress, came over to us and called us all together and says, "Boy, you guys really screwed up, didn't you?" Well, we looked at him and said, well, what are you saying? I mean, we tried to treat this like a big laboratory experiment, but on a much, much larger scale. He says, "No, you're absolutely right," and so forth. He says, but there's something you didn't know. The AEC would have been very, very happy if you turned in 10% of those 1,200 channels with 10% data. But you guys didn't know any better. So you only turned in 98% of the channels with 5% data. We don't know what the hell to do with all this data right now. And so it was a backhanded, real serious compliment. So needless to say, any time that their team was kind of breaking up and so forth, there was employers from all over the country wanted to have us, okay? There was just no problem with transferring on into some other activity. Most of us wanted to go home, but quite a few of them stayed along on at Sandia Base and were tying in with the instrumentation on many of the follow-along groups.
Great. Now, in your lifetime, you've seen a lot of change in a lot of different areas. If there's any advice that you could give to today's generation?
Yeah, well, I think one very important thing, very on in life, when people are starting to go into college or thinking about some sort of profession out in the field, some area that they really feel they would do good in, they like it, they ought to think very carefully. And as I try to tell them, look, the colleges ask for you to have a foreign language. Many of you take Spanish because, well, heavens, that's easy, but everybody's speaking Spanish around here. You can pick that language up on the streets if you want it. But stop and think that French is the language of diplomacy. Latin is the language of the doctors and the lawyers. German is the language of the physicists and the chemists. English is the language of the aircraft for communication between the airborne and the ground systems. And Spanish is the language of labor. Now, pick the language that fits what you would really like to do. It will help you in reading the literature and keeping up to date. I think that's a real key point. And mind you, when you go into construction and so forth, and there's a lot of construction needs and so forth, people are all talking Spanish. You need that for your help that's coming across the border. Bingo. So.
Great. Is there anything else that may come to mind that maybe you didn't mention that you may want to include?
Well, I'll tell you, I keep looking back every once in a while at what the opportunities were for the GI Bill. And I think I tried to make very, very good use of it by taking all the classes. I had mathematics, so differential equations, integral calculus, you name it, up to vector analysis and so forth, you name it, down the line. I had some good physics classes with top people. In fact, my physics prof, the last I know, he transferred from the college area. He went over to the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, okay, to take place and follow on in Einstein's area. Clark Leahy, he was over at mathematics extraordinary over at UCLA. I've been very fortunate. I look back that some of the people that stayed behind and went to schools while the rest of us were out at the war, they made good use of their time getting well educated and populating things. So I had wonderful instructors. And so I look back and I say, you know, the GI Bill was the one that put me through school. The GI Bill was paid off by the government. So when I fill out my tax returns at the end of the year, if I look at the numbers at the bottom line, I say, you know, those are pretty big numbers. And I think, because there's a lot of people out there complaining about the big numbers. I don't complain about the big numbers because that's why I'm here. It aided me to be here. And so it might be payback time now.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think that covers about everything.
I had no, well, like I say, there's a whole bunch of things that kind of ticks off.
Yeah.
I hope I gave you plenty of data.
I
But before we go, or sit back,